Okay, maybe I'll go ahead and get started because I was already thinking ahead until 12:30, and I only have until 12. So depending on what we do this afternoon, I may either save the last half hour for the beginning of the next talk or just skip through quickly. So a couple of days ago, I was presenting a kind of overview of ideas I think are important in cognitive development. Actually, can I stop 1 second? I have a really loud echo here from the microphone. Let's see. Somehow when I talked yesterday, I didn't hear myself projecting into a great big space. Is there a way to dampen it a little bit? Yeah, great. That seems more normal. Okay, great. So I did a big overview of ideas in cognitive development, and today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about my research program in particular. So what I was doing in a kind of whirlwind way was telling you the backdrop against which, in some sense, my research program emerged. So what had been going on about when I started graduate school. And one of those big revolutions was in our understanding of infant cognition. So the idea that babies knew much more about the physical and social world than we believed. So we talked about those drawbridge studies by René Baillargeon and Liz Spelke's studies of infant object concept. There are a lot of work I didn't talk about. I skipped the part on number, but early numerical representations, number representations in babies, both small exact and large approximate numbers. And then also a lot of early social cognition, so stuff about goals, and I showed you these studies as well. So in addition to these early abilities, which are plausibly innate in our species and other species or very early emerging, there was also a revolution in our understanding of early childhood. So it wasn't just for babies. As researchers began looking at preschoolers, it became clear that children also understood the world in ways that were much richer than Piaget and others had believed, that their understanding of both the psychological and the physical world were abstract, were coherent, were causal, supported prediction, explanation, and intervention in ways that seemed to justify, and made reference to non-obvious properties, in ways that seemed to justify referring to them as naive theories. So as I'm sure you've heard in various ways, and as I was trying to allude to at the beginning of the last talk, one of the real, answers to how we think and how we learn is going to be the structure of the representations. It's not a bunch of knowledge and isolated facts, Doug Lenat style. It's going to make reference to structure, and the way we've talked about those structures in the developmental world has been as folk theories of physics, theories of psychology. And this research forms the background to why. But essentially, all of this research was really about the representation of knowledge. What is knowledge like? What kind of knowledge children have? Is it abstract? Is it coherent? Is it causal? In some respects, in these ways, does it make reference to unobserved variables? It wasn't actually a research program about learning. So although this work is often talked about as the child of scientist or the scientist in the crib, the reference to science was really about the structure of the representations, not about the acquisition of knowledge. And again, it's how I started graduate school with this metaphor of the child of scientist. And it's a problematic metaphor because, of course, science is this historically recent, culturally specific innovation. It's practiced by a very tiny minority of our species, and as all of us know, it's very, very difficult. So it might seem like a very strange place to look for fundamental properties of cognition. But science has this very strange property, which is it gets the world right. And it sometimes gets the world right in these startlingly accurate ways. So if you really want to understand the generation of new knowledge, one thing you might want to ask is, how is that possible? What kind of learning mechanisms should allow you to go from the stuff of the world and some stuff in your head to actually generating brand new ideas about the world? So it seems in that sense a very important place to look. And so you might want to start by asking, well, what is it scientists do? And the answer to that question, of course, is that we both do and do not know, which is to say that both formally and informally, we can list a lot of things that scientists do, and here are some of them. And they will all be familiar to you, and they would be familiar to you if you were a neuroscientist, or if you were a paleontologist, or if you were a botanist. These are the kinds of things that arguably unite scientific inquiry across content domains. if you did every single thing on this list, you couldn't necessarily do science, right? Science requires bringing these abilities to bear on a lot of rich, detailed, culturally acquired content knowledge, often with very specialized tools, right? So this is in no way sufficient for doing science. But arguably, if you had all that culturally transmitted rich knowledge and all of those technical skills, but you didn't do these kinds of things, you couldn't learn anything at all. So these are the kinds of epistemic practices that are arguably fundamental to inference and discovery. And what I want to suggest, in fact, the heart of my research program has been to suggest that they are fundamental to inference and discovery, not just in science, which our culture canalizes in these particular ways, but they are fundamental in early childhood. They're fundamental to learning. And that is because these are the only kinds of practices that we know of that can actually enable you to solve the hard problem of learning, which is the problem of how to go from sparse, noisy data to rich, abstract inferences relatively rapidly. And so what I want to suggest is that all of these properties are, all of these epistemic practices are actually present in children in the first few years of life. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. And I said a minute ago that we can characterize these abilities both formally and informally. And by we here, I of course mean my computational modeling colleagues, not me. Which is to say, we can do, reasonably good models of how you might maximize information gain in certain contexts, or how you might distinguish spurious associations from genuine causes. For any number of these, and from much of the research that I do, it's been inspired by computational models of how you might do this, or how you might do this, or how you might do this. But with greatest respect for my computational modeling colleagues, and as much as we want simple laws that are going to capture these kinds of practices, things like Hebb's law or Bayes' law, none of them really does justice to what children do. And that is because none of these principles explain why all of these. And there's nothing magic about all of these. This is a laundry list. We don't have some computational model that tells you all and everything that's necessary for inference, for exploration, for learning and discovery. We don't know the fundamental computational principles that unify processes of search and discovery. We cannot replace you or us with machine learning at this stage, even though we can be quite precise about any one of these in some individual set of cases. I think that remains a very hard problem of cognitive science, one I hope you will all contribute to. But what we can do is we can say that that's the kind of model to which our theories should aspire, because there's good empirical data that this is the kind of learning in which humans, including very, very young humans, engage in. So that's what I'm going to start out with today. I'm going to just take a couple of these and from the list and show you some experiments that lend support to this. But the whole list has been supported by research from many other labs besides my own. That's part one of the talk. But and so I'm just going to shorthand it like this, and actually I can talk about 4 studies, including one recent study ongoing in the lab. But the second part of the talk is going to be this, which is I've just suggested that children are engaged in all of these epistemic practices that really support rich learning. And at the same time, we all have a strong intuition, as I said, that learning is hard. Learning is difficult, challenging, and there's lots of reason to think that children and the rest of us are often not very good at it in particular ways. And so I want to speak a little bit to both sides of that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes learning hard. And if I have time then at the very end or in the next half hour, I'm going to talk about how this tension between rational learning and yet the costs of learning are not only characterize how we learn ourselves, but we understand those when we are interpreting the behavior of other agents, and that those joint understandings help us make sense of other people's behavior in some of the ways I think Rebecca was alluding to earlier. But I might not get to that until the second half of today, if at all. But we'll try to get there. Okay, so let me jump in and just provide a little data to say why we think some of these practices that we might think of as scientific practices are actually quite basic to cognition. So I'll start with a simple one. Science, of course, depends on drawing generalizations from small samples of data. right? So if I want to generalize from a small sample, there are lots of cues I can use. In particular, I can use feature similarity. You look like a person. If I open you up and I find out you have a spleen inside, I don't need to open up everyone else in the room. I can just say, probably they look a little bit like you. Maybe they all have spleens too, right? So children can do this too. If you have one rattle and it shakes, you know, a very young baby will shake other things that look like rattles and expect that they're going to make noise. So feature generalization is very simple. Much more friendly way, I can just establish linguistically that you have a certain label, you're a person, people have spleens, end of story. I can generalize from an object label, from a category, and use that as a inductive bias to guide my feature generalization. Children can do that too. If one DAX lights up a toy, other DAXs light up the toy. But as scientists, we can, we of course do this. So for instance, if I take a sample of Martian rocks that has a high concentration of silica, maybe all Martian rocks have a high concentration of silica. If I take some Pacific silver fir needles and I find out that they lay flat on the branch, I can say, okay, so do other Pacific silver fir needles, right? This is a common practice. But in science, we do something a little bit more sophisticated than this. Sometimes we know something about how our evidence is sampled that affects the kinds of inferences we're willing to draw. And sometimes it lets us ask suspicious questions like this. Do all Martian rocks have high concentrations of silica, or just those that were easy to put in your bag because they were hanging out on the surface of Mars and they were right there, and maybe they were, you know, dusty from the surface? Do all Pacific silver fir needles lie on the branch, or just those that were low on the canopy and you could kind of easily pull off the tree? And if you think you cherry-picked your evidence, if you think it's a selective sample, if you think it might not be representative of the population, you're going to constrain your generalizations accordingly, in this case to just populations that are very near the ground. What we wanted to know was how far this kind of inference extended in development. So when we're making generalizations, it depends on how we got that sample. If we think it was a random sampling process or a selective sampling process, and we wanted to know whether inference generalizations were just dependent on feature similarity or on labels in the ways I've described, or if they would also take the sampling process into account. Okay, so how are you going to do this with a baby? In this case, we showed babies a box that had a transparent false front that looked kind of like that, and it had dog toys inside. And so the dog toys are blue and yellow balls, and in this box, they are mostly blue. And as far as the babies can tell, it's not a false front. It looks like it's a full box of balls. We reach in, we pull out a blue ball, we squeak it. We pull out a second blue ball and we squeak it. We pull out a third blue ball and we squeak it. And then we go ahead and hand the baby a yellow ball that has been disabled. Okay, we've removed the squeaker. So now we can look not just at whether babies squeeze that ball, but how often they squeak it, how strong their expectation is that that thing's going to squeak. In this case, there's a lot of feature similarity. This is a dog toy and that's a dog toy, right? There's a lot of reason to think that the babies maybe should squeak it, but also there's nothing particularly suspicious about that sample. You could easily reach into a box just like this and randomly pull out 3 toys. And if, you know, those 3 toys, the first 3 toys you happen to randomly pull out of a box squeak, probably all the balls in the box squeak. And we expect that, in this case, many children should try squeezing that ball and that they should squeeze often. You can compare it with a case like this. We're going to pull exactly the same sample out of the box. But in this case, of course, it's very unlikely that you just randomly reached into the box and happened to get 3 blue balls. The motions are identical in both cases. They're consistent with you either knowing what's in the box or you randomly sampling. But you didn't just randomly reach into a box with mostly yellow balls and pull out 3 blue balls that squeak. That's unlikely to have been sampled from the whole box and much more likely to have been sampled selectively. And if children are sensitive to that, then they might constrain their generalization. It might say the property just obtains to the population you sampled. And in this case, fewer children should try squeaking that ball, and the children should squeeze less often. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to show you a couple of babies. And they're actually, you know, all seeing 3 squeaky balls and they're all getting a yellow ball. So they're going to do a lot of the same things because they're all playing with the same toy. We actually attached that handle so they could do something other than squeeze it if they wanted to. And I want to show you what it looks like. And although they're getting the same toy, only in this case do we really expect the kids to squeeze persistently. Being 15 months. All right. So I'm going to show you just the data reporting the mean number of squeezes, but we also looked at the number of children who squeaked at all, and it shows exactly the same pattern. And what we found, in fact, is that the children were squeezed much more persistently in the case where it looked like the sample was arguably represented the population than when they thought the sample was selective. So this suggests they're sensitive to something about the relationship between the sample and population, but what is it? It could be that in this case, the children are just unwilling to generalize. They're willing to generalize from a majority object to a minority, but they're not willing to generalize from a minority object to the majority. So they may not be sensitive to the sampling process, even if they're sampling sensitive to some aspect of the relationship between the sample and the population. So to check this, we replicated this condition. We again pulled 3 blue balls from the mostly yellow box, a pretty unlikely sample, and we compared it to a condition like this, where we pulled just 1 blue ball from the mostly yellow box. Now the children are going to see less squeaking, right? This is just a single blue ball. But the important point is that this is not an improbable sample. You could randomly reach into a box, pull a ball, and if it squeaks, maybe everything in that box squeaks. Right? So even though the children are going to see less squeaking over here, we predict in this case, if they really are sensitive to the sampling process, they themselves should squeeze more often. So we did this in 2 different ways. We squeezed 1 blue ball once, and then we also did one where we squeezed 1 blue ball 3 times, and we got the same results in both cases. In fact, what you see is that when the sample looks like it could have been randomly drawn from the box, the children tend to generalize the property and squeeze the yellow ball more often, but when it looks like it's an improbable sample, we replicated the effect that they were unlikely to generalize the property. So importantly, the kids are not just imitating how often they saw the ball squeak across this pattern of evidence, they will sometimes squeeze more even though they themselves have seen squeezing less. Finally, of course, we were fitting this to a computational model, which is a little bit tricky with babies. We could do a 1, 2, and 3 data point. And you can see that there is a graded progression of how often the children are willing to squeak, which is sensitive both to the amount of evidence they get and the relationship between the evidence and the sample. And this is actually consistent with 2 different possibilities. One is that the children are jointly inferring the sampling process and the extension of the object properties. And the other possibility is that they just assume that people are engaged in strong sampling. What it's not consistent with is the possibility that they just flat out assume random sampling across the board. There's one other prediction you might want to make, which is what happens if you see the same evidence, but you specify behaviorally what the sampling process is. So suppose you take that blue box and you shake it, and 3 blue balls fall out. Well, that is an extremely improbable sample, but we're at MIT. We can have a hidden compartment such that 3 blue balls fall out, even of a mostly yellow box. And if they do, then in this case, kids would say, well, I don't know, it's an improbable sample, but if you can just shake the box and 3 squeaky balls fall out, probably all the balls in the box squeak. And in that case, the kids themselves should squeeze more often. And in fact, that's what we find. So there's a sharp distinction between this condition and this condition over here. Is that clear? Okay, so 15-month-old generalizations take into account more than perceptual similarity, more than category membership. They're sensitive to both the amount of evidence they observe and the process by which the evidence is sampled. That's generalization of categories, right? Here's a property, how far should I extend the property? But a lot of what we want to do in learning about this world is make causal inferences. We want to figure out the best explanation for the events that we observe. And to look at this in children, we gave them what I think is maybe the most fundamental problem of confounded evidence that all of us face, which is that we are in the world. And this might not seem like a problem to you, but like most problems, it's only a problem when things go wrong. And when things go wrong, you may not know, well, is it me? Is it something I did? Or is it something out there? What should I change? Right? You walk into your friend's house, you go to the bathroom, you flip on the switch, and nothing happens. Well, if you think that you flipped the wrong switch, you should ask your friend for help. If you think something is wrong with the world, you should change the world, or at least the light bulb out there, right? So being able to divide between these distinctions is an important one. And what we're going to do here is give the kids a toy that they can't make work, and we're going to ask whether they can distinguish these kinds of 2 attributions. If they think they can't make it work and it's a problem, they should go ask for help. They should approach another agent. But if they think that the world is at fault on something, there's the problem, then they should go ahead and reach for another toy. This may seem like a fairly crude cut, me or the world. But it's an important one. It's been instantiated in artificial intelligence and machine learning is the difference between the agent state and the environmental state, and in education literature with issues of locus of control. Did I not study hard enough, or was that test too hard, right, or test unfair? So you can make these different attributions, and of course, once you know this, there's still a lot you don't know. You don't know what you did wrong or what exactly is wrong with the world, but it helps to carve up the hypothesis space. So what we're going to ask in this study is whether 16-month-olds can use minimal statistical data to make appropriate causal attributions, and then choose to seek help or explore based on these different inferences. So let me show you how we did this. We gave some kids some toys. I'm just going to show you the second experiment we ran. It's an experiment that involved two experimenters. And in one condition, each experimenter succeeded and failed once. So one experimenter pushed the toy and it worked, and then tried again and failed. And then the second experimenter tried the same thing and failed and succeeded. And this suggests that something is probably wrong with the toy, right? Maybe there's a weak circuit or a missing battery, who knows what, but that's not a very good toy. You should probably, if you have a choice, reach out and change your toy, get another toy. The other condition was quite similar, except we varied the distribution across of outcomes across the experimenters. So one experimenter always succeeded and the second experimenter always failed. This suggests that the second experimenter is incompetent, right? So if some people can make it go and other people can't, then when you yourself can't make it go, it slightly shifts the weight of evidence to suggest maybe I can't do it, maybe somebody else can. And if kids are sensitive to this shift in attribution, they should say, well, it's probably me, change the agent, okay? So of course, this is very sparse data. They're just getting a couple of trials. So not the world of big data in. We're in the world of tiny data. That's the world that babies and children learn from and live in, right? Very small data. And again, both of these outcomes are possible. What you're shifting is the inductive bias, the probability that one attribution is more likely than the other. We want to know if kids were sensitive to this. So again, I'll show you a little bit of what it looked like. All right. So, and this is what we found across subjects, right? So we found a distribution, their tendency to reach for help or to reach for another object. I, like everyone, am guilty of bringing up like the cutest babies for the talks and the most demonstrative. But in the case of this study, it's actually a requirement of science that the senior author looks at every single bit of raw data. So I looked at every one of these tapes. And in this experiment, you could have pulled any of these babies. They are extremely clear. They are handing you the toy. They are reaching for help. It is a very distinctive pattern of evidence across these children. This suggests that by 16 months, children are tracking the statistical dependence between agents, objects, and outcomes. They can use minimal data to make attributions about the cause of failed goal-directed actions. And quite nicely in this particular setup, it left them with, two different strategies, right? They could seek help from others, instructions probably too strong, or they could go ahead and explore the world on their own. I want to shift a little bit and bump us up in age. I'm going to take you now to older children, to preschoolers, because we're going to ask not just whether children can learn from evidence, including very small amounts of evidence, but whether they can selectively seek out and find that evidence in the case where evidence is ambiguous. So do they actually design and act on the kinds of interventions you might need to learn about the world? Here's the setup for this study. How many of you played with like little snap together beads when you were in preschool? Remember these like big plastic beads? You could snap them together and make chains. Raise your hands, yes. You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay. So that's what we gave the kids here. They're each uniquely colored. But what we did with these beads is we put them one at a time on a toy, and the toy lit up and made music. And in one condition, every single bead activated the toy. In the other condition, only some of the beads did. Kids had no way of knowing until they tried which beads did and which beads didn't. But the important thing is always varied between conditions. Here was the base rate of the effective beads. Here, every bead works. Here, only some of the beads work. What we did next is we showed the children two pairs of beads. One pair was a stuck pair. We'd epoxied it together. We couldn't pull it apart. We handed it to the kids. They couldn't pull it apart. We all knew that bead could not come apart. The other pair was an ordinary snap-together pair of beads. The kid was allowed to snap them apart together as long as they wanted, right? So they could tell that was a separable pair. Then we put both pairs back together, and we put them on the toy one at a time as a pair, right? And this pair made the toy go, and this pair made the toy go. And then we walked away. What were we thinking? We were thinking, in principle, of course, the evidence is confounded in all of these cases. Maybe just this bead made it go. Maybe just this bead made it go. Maybe they both did for each pair. But if you have just learned that every bead makes this toy go, there's not a lot of ambiguity. There's not a lot of possibility of information gain. You should probably assume that every one of these beads makes the toy go. And if that's the case, you should play indiscriminately with these pairs of beads. But in the some bead conditions, there really is a possibility of information gain. Only some beads work, and you know that. So maybe it's only this bead, or maybe it's only this bead, or maybe it's both of them, and same with this pair over here. But only one of these bead pairs has the right affordances to learn something. Only one of them lets you isolate variables. Only the separable pair of bead can you pull apart and put on individually one at a time in the toy. So if you're sensitive to the possibility of information gain, and you are sensitive to which pair has the right affordances to let you isolate variables and learn, the kids should selectively play with the separable pair just in the some beads condition. And that is, in fact, exactly what we found. In the all beads condition, only one child ever snapped apart the beads and put them on the toy. In the some beads condition, half the children did that and did the intervention exhaustively, put on each pair one at a time on the toy. But my graduate student at the time said, you know, they're also doing something kind of interesting with the stuck pair. And I said, what can they do with the stuck pair? It's stuck. There's nothing that you can do. And she said, well, let's try it again with just the stuck pair of beads. And so we did it again. We assigned the kids to the all beads condition or the some beads condition. But this time the kids only saw the stuck pair placed on the toy. The stuck pair made the toy go. And I want to let you watch what one of the kids did here. Right, so she's going to show them the individual beads. We'll skip through a little bit. Now she's going to hand the child this pair. That's what we did, and that's what the child's doing. And she plays. And now she does something we have never done, and that she's never seen before. But which, if you have a folk theory of contact causality, is not a bad way to try to isolate your variable and to try to figure out which bead makes the toy go. So that is the kind of intervention that had not occurred, for instance, to the PI on this study. But it makes a lot of sense consistent with an intuitive theory of contact causality, which is we know what 4-year-olds have about how things are likely to work. And again, when we ran this experiment, you almost never saw that behavior in the all beads condition. Again, about half the kids designed this intervention and tried it out in the some beads condition. So just to suggest that preschoolers can use information about the base rate of candidate causes to distinguish the relative ambiguity of evidence. And they not only select, they can design potentially informative interventions that isolate causal variables. Now I want to talk about some new work in the lab on a kind of similar theme. One way the interventions can be uninformative is because they fail to isolate variables, right? You know that they're confounded. But there's another way interventions can be uninformative because you just can't tell their outcomes apart. So let me give you an example. Suppose you go to your doctor and say, well, look, you may have disease A, you might have disease B. I'm going to give you this blood test. And so we're going to put this Z element in a tissue sample in a vial and shake it up. And if it's disease A, the vial's going to turn red. And if it's disease B, the vial's going to turn maroon. Okay, and it's up to that lab tech to tell you which of the disease, one is incurable and the other one, you know, you're going to live forever and be just fine. you may not be totally delighted by this task because you can tell this is going to be a really hard thing to tell apart. You might be much happier if you said, by the way, there's another kind of assay we could run, the X assay, and if it's disease A, it's going to turn red, and if it's B, it's going to turn blue. Okay? That seems like, on the whole, a much better intervention. The evidence is much more distinguishable. You're going to be able to make better kinds of attributions. So if children are sensitive to the probability of information gain, they should prefer, all else being equal, interventions that generate really distinctive pattern of evidence. What does it mean to be distinctive? It means you can tell them apart, right? Which means that in this sense, the way we've been talking about it in our lab, and this is, by the way, work by Max Siegel, who's pretending to not exist right now, but he's over there in the corner, as an intuitive psychophysics, right? Children have to be aware of their own ability to discriminate stimuli, to be able to tell what is going to be ambiguous or not in these cases, and to make relevant judgments. All right, we're not going to put children's tissues in vials, so what we're going to do instead is this. Here's the very simplest version of a test like this. We're going to give kids a really, that you can't tell here, it looks gray, but this is the coolest pencil you've ever seen. It's hologram, it's shiny. If you were 5, you would want it. The kids get that pencil if they can find it, and they have a choice between this hologram pencil and this really boring pencil, and one of these two is going to go into this box here. It's either the hologram pencil or the boring pencil. It's going to go into this. And in this box, it's either the hologram pencil or this beanbag. That's what's going to go in this box. And you know what you're going to do? You're going to shake each box. And you know what you're going to hear? A pencil. Or no, sorry. You're going to hear da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And now the question is, which box should you open? Right? And if kids are sensitive, of course, to where the evidence is more discriminable, they should certainly open this box here, where it was either the pencil or the beanbag, and not this box here, where the evidence can be hard to discriminate. That's a relatively simple test of the concept. Here's a harder one. Here's a case where you really want these beautiful colored marbles here, right? You don't want the boring white marbles. In this box, there are 8 beautiful colored marbles and 2 really boring white marbles. And one of those vials is going to get poured into the box. And this box is either these 8 beautiful colored marbles or these 6 super boring white marbles. Which box should you open if you want the colored marbles? Well, if kids are sensitive to the discriminability of evidence, they should prefer this box. Let me show you a little bit of how this works. This is work by Rachel Magid and, again, Max here. I'll let it run through a little bit. She's going to repeat all of that, and then she's going to ask the child, which box should, okay? All right, so, go ahead.
So, if I didn't listen at all, I find the design pretty compelling, but if I had my eyes open, my ears closed, I think the inference would be the same.
Exactly, and so one thing you want to know is, can they only do it once they hear the evidence, or can they do it predictively? Can they do it even without hearing it? Do they recognize in advance which kind of evidence is going to be more discriminable? We run that experiment too. So you give them a choice before you shake the box, and you say which one do you want to open. But in order to answer a question like that, you have to, in some sense, say, well, what are 8 marbles going to sound like, what are 2 marbles going to sound like, what are 8 marbles going to sound like, what are 6 marbles going to sound like, and know that this is a more discriminable pattern of data than the other, or what's the difference between a pencil and a beanbag and a pencil and a pencil. And you have to be able to know that one of those is going to be more discriminable than the other in advance and choose the more informative intervention. So we run it both this way, where they get the evidence, and predictively when you're trying to look at the evidence.
So the beanbag and the pencil I get, but the marbles, the proportion of color to non-color is, if I were just to draw at random, I would go for the one with fewer of the white ones, not because it would be less discriminable, but because just my chance random sampling, I would get more, like I'd be more likely to get colored ones.
They're in as a whole vial. They don't go in separately, right? So either this entire tube goes in or this entire tube goes in. Right, so these are fixed, they're quantized, right?
Okay.
And what you'll see is kids are very, very good at this. And they are importantly good at this anticipatorily as well as in a context like this.
So in these cases, though, once you've shaken both boxes, it maybe it's easier to discriminate if there's only 2 white marbles. It always
You always hear the same thing in both boxes. You always hear the desirable thing. So the actual thing kids hear is the same. So really importantly, they have to, in some sense, be thinking counterfactually, would I have been able to hear a difference if it were this versus that? They're always hearing the same thing. They always hear the pencil. They always hear the 8 marble. Yeah.
So the way she described an experiment was that those were her marbles and she had to find them as opposed to being which one she preferred. But you can imagine that if she wasn't told specifically to find her marbles, that you might want more marbles. And then if you choose the one on the right, then that will always give you more marbles.
For this reason, we didn't want to, right? So if you start introducing the kids' preferences, some kids are going to prefer beanbags, some kids are going to prefer yellow, right? So we wanted to fix for them what the constraints of the task were, right? Because otherwise it'd be super hard to interpret what they were doing or why.
Can they describe why they chose the box? I mean,
We have some kids articulating
I can
it.
play some videos if you
Yeah, they're actually quite good at telling you and explaining, why this evidence is and what should be. And again, I feel like this is one of those things. It seems like a simple task, right? Like in some ways, like of course. But now write down. You all are the right people to ask this. Okay, so now get a machine to do it, right? What do you have to do to solve a problem like that? Like what kinds of information needs to be available online rapidly such that you can recognize that in this causal context of shaking with this kind of psychophysical evidence and this kind of simulation of the physics of the world and your perceptual properties, you can make that kind of discrimination effortlessly at age 4 or 3 even. We have 3-year-olds doing it. That turns out to be a hard problem, deceptively hard, but I think if you try to actually make it work, you will see what kinds of sophistication have to go into even relatively simple tests. Okay, so preschoolers arguably have an intuitive psychophysics. They know when evidence is more or less distinguishable. They prefer interventions that generate distinctive patterns. So now I've shown you kind of a very small tip of what can be an entire talk on look how smart children are, right? Look at all the wonderful smart things they do that are kind of hard for us to understand and to figure out. And usually, depending on who I'm talking to, the audience is more or less bristling at this point and saying, yeah, but I have to say, if you read the newspaper at all, have you heard about the crisis of STEM education in America? Don't you know people are bad at science? If they're so good at this, why are 5th graders incapable of answering, remedial questions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to say, well, if children are so smart, if they can do all these kinds of things. And again, there's evidence across a host of labs for the emergence of these abilities in preschool and infants and in toddlerhood and even younger sometimes. Why is learning hard? Right? What are some of the problems? So again, I'm going to adjust this with some research in my lab, but I think you can find it across labs. And I'll try to gesture at a few of these ideas. Okay. So one reason, of course, is was illustrated actually by an experiment that set out to show why children were so smart, right? So this is actually the first experiment I think I ran when I started at MIT. And we were just going to give kids a recurring variable here, A, and A was always going to be paired with an effect, but it was also going to be paired with a constantly changing variable, B, C, D, E, F, G. And basically we wanted to know if at the end of the day kids were given a choice between A and G, would they pick A instead of G as the cause of the effect, right? So this seems very simple, and of course it is. We give them a whole story, Monday morning, Bambi runs in the pine grove, gets excited, runs in the cattails, has itchy spots in his legs. That keeps happening. He keeps running in cattails and getting itchy spots all the way until Sunday morning when he runs in the garden in the pine grove, gets itchy spots, and you want to know, well, why does he have itchy spots? You really should be able to say the pine grove. He doesn't always have itchy spots in the afternoon. He's fine, so there's no ceiling effect problem here. And this should be relatively easy if the kids are tracking the evidence. What we were interested in this case, kids have no prior beliefs. They have nothing at stake in why you make the itchy spots in the world. We compared it with a case like this. Kids have a stake in what causes tummy aches. And it happens, we know from previous research in kids' intuitive theories, that they believe that eating things that are bad for you can cause tummy aches, but they do not believe in psychosomatic causality. So even though they are subject to it, they sometimes get tummy aches when they're scared, they don't believe in it. And they will deny that being scared or being afraid can make you have a tummy ache. So on Monday morning, Bunny's going to think about show and tell and eat some cheese and get a tummy ache. And on Tuesday, he's going to think about show and tell and eat a popsicle and get a tummy ache, et cetera, et cetera. And Sunday, he's going to sandwich and think about show and tell and have a tummy ache. And if kids are integrating their prior beliefs with the data they get, even though being scared occurs just as often as the cattails does, children should be less likely to endorse the A variable in this condition than in this condition. But they should still be more likely to learn from the evidence when it's repeated than they are when they just initially see the data. And in fact, that's exactly what we see with the 4-year-olds, right? So you see this very nice mapping among the group of the 16-year-olds where the kids are basically at ceiling and within domain condition after they see the evidence. And they substantially increase their endorsement of being scared after they see the evidence, which they initially do not believe in. So that seems very clear, and that seems like another, okay, well, kids are smart. But I want to show you the 3.5-year-olds. 3.5-year-olds look just like the 4-year-olds when the evidence is theory neutral, but they're completely flat when the evidence is theory violating. They absolutely never chose being scared. And there are a couple of possibilities. Maybe 3.5-year-olds have stronger convictions, right? They just really, really, really don't believe that being scared can cause tummy aches, and it's going to take twice as much evidence or 3 times as much evidence to convince them. But there's another possibility, which is that this task is hard for them, and that any kind of additional conflict or additional load makes it hard for them to answer these questions. And one reason to think that might be the case is if you look at the data from 3-year-olds, they don't learn in either condition, right? It looks trivial to you, but these kids have to sit down and read a storybook through 7 pages of evidence with a stranger and answer questions about it. So what we did in this case was do a training study. I don't need to walk you through all of it, but the important point is we just taught 3.5-year-olds to sit through a lot of books that were not about psychosomatic causality, but which did have recurring variables in them, so they got used to this task and this kind of presentation. And after having done that, then we asked them to explain the cause of a tummy ache, and the trained group did much better than control. The only reason I'm walking you through all of this is to say it would be really foolish to be a developmental psychologist of any kind and say that information processing abilities don't matter. Information processing abilities is an extremely vague term. It's kind of an umbrella for all the things that we don't tend to talk about when we're talking about computational models of intelligence and learning, right? We're talking about things like the ability to sit still. We're talking about the ability to inhibit responses. We're talking about the ability to direct your attention and not get distracted. We're talking about how well you're following the language of the task. We're talking about a whole range of skills, ranging from executive function to inhibition, to just the ability to keep track and remember memory abilities to data. Those things matter. They affect performance. They can affect performance hugely, which is part of why it is really important if you really are testing children not to mistake performance deficits for competence deficits. It's easy to make kids fail. It's easy to confuse them. You need very simple tasks often to show these abilities, and it's important that they fall apart under other kinds of task demands, because we build a lot of cognitive tools. You're sitting in front of a bunch of them to support us in this ways, and that's what enables us to do some of the sophisticated reasoning we do. And a lot of what happens in science learning is the ability to use those tools. Kids are very good at these things. Hand them a ruler and ask them to measure things, they're hopeless. It takes them a long time just to learn to line up a ruler with an edge, let alone to make a little table or a little chart where they can track what happened. And those kinds of tools, I think we shouldn't underestimate how important they are to what we do. Here's another thing that seems really basic, but I don't think we can emphasize enough just how big an impact it can have on the kind of behavior and responses you get from kids. This is an old test. It's from Piaget and Inhelder. They found that children play with blocks. You've seen from Josh a lot of really good intuitive physics about blocks. But if you ask for children's explicit theories about blocks, they undergo a transition. So the little ones don't really have an intuitive theory about blocks. They just balance proprioceptively and they're quite good at it. But somewhere around 6, they have a theory, and they will explicitly tell you at a certain age that blocks balance in their geometric center. So if you ask them to point and make a prediction about these blocks, they will tell you that each one of these clearly asymmetric blocks balances right here in the midpoint, which is a pretty good generalization from non-asymmetric blocks, but really doesn't work very well for these kinds of blocks. And it's only a little bit later that the kids go ahead and shift and realize, actually, you need to do this here. Now, this is an explicit prediction. Proprioceptively, of course, the kids compensate. But if you ask them what their theory is of how it works, they have a wrong theory initially. So what we did in this study is we asked kids to make predictions like this, and we sorted kids who on 3 for 3 trials picked the center from kids who on 3 for 3 trials knew to adjust. And so we got 32 kids in each condition. What I want you to know is these kids are they could be in the same classroom. You couldn't tell them apart, right? But they have really different theories about how the world works. They have different world knowledge in a certain sense. But they're quite closely matched in age. We call these guys mass theorists and these ones center theorists. And then we ran a little experiment like this. We let them play with the block. We let them find out it was asymmetric, got familiarized with it. And then we popped it up like this, and we brought out a brand new toy. They played with that toy for a lot, and we walked away, and we wanted to know what the kids would do. And the prediction is that if kids selectively explore evidence that violates their intuitive theories, then for the center theorists, that should be really surprising. They should go back and play with the familiar toy, but the mass theorists should go ahead and play with the novel toy. And of course, we compared it with a condition like this, where we popped it up just like this. And the prediction, again, is if kids selectively explore theory-violating evidence, well, the mass theorists now should go ahead and go back and play with this familiar toy, but the center theorists should go ahead and play with the novel toy. Is that clear? And, of course, that's what we found. So the kids are seeing the same evidence, but their prior beliefs about what should happen is affecting their pattern of exploration and what they play with. It's not just affecting their exploration, it's also affecting their explanations. When you play with this, you might wonder how it is that we managed to get a asymmetrically weighted block to stand up like this. And again, we're at MIT, we can do sneaky things. So we put a magnet under there, and it sticks. And to be fair, we put a magnet in both conditions, and every child discovers the magnet when they're playing, right? So all the kids spent some time playing with that block, and all of them find the magnet. And in all cases, the magnet's a sufficient explanation for why that block stays up. If I say, why is that block staying up? You could always refer to the magnet. But what we predicted is that the children would selectively appeal to the magnet just when the evidence violated their theories. So that's what we looked for, and in fact, that's what we found. So although all the children had found the magnet in play, you can see that from the way they play with the toy. If you ask them to explain the evidence, if the evidence is consistent with their theories, they don't refer to the magnet. If the evidence violates their theories, they do. What does this have to do with the bigger picture program? World knowledge affects how children are going to learn about the world, and it's going to affect what they're going to explore and how they're going to explain data, such that theories can get entrenched, right? If you really think the world would work a certain way, if you really have a theory, that might entrench your learning in particular ways. Which brings me to what I think is maybe the most interesting reason that learning is hard, which is that the same exact things that make us good at learning and that make us smart make learning hard, right? It's part of a single process. You've all know Kahneman's diversity. You know that there may be a mass of heuristics that get in our way and that causes problems, and sometimes we think fast and sometimes we think slow. But I think that one of the really interesting tensions is not that we have different things that cause us to behave in different ways, but that we sometimes have single ways of thinking about the world. We have a set of inductive principles that are guiding us quite well that are going to do both, that are going to make us smart and also make learning hard, we'll say. Let me show you an example right here. I'm going to introduce you to a brand new world with just a few simple causal laws. These are the only laws that operate in this world. In this world, there is an indicator. If you mix it with an acid, it turns blue. If you mix the indicator with an oxidant, nothing happens. And if you mix the oxidant with an acid, it explodes. Now, I want you to learn this. This is your world, 3 causal laws. Now you go down into your grandmother's basement, and you pull out a vial, and because you are an intrepid scientist, you mix it with the acid. And guess what? It turns blue. Now, you've never seen that vial before, you're not totally sure what it is, but how many of you, intrepid scientists, think that you can now go ahead and safely mix the contents of the mixture vial with the accident? Show of hands, do you think that's probably okay? It's not a bad bet. Small data, right, constrained by those prior beliefs. But sure, if you mix this with the acid and turn blue, it's probably an indicator. If you mix it with the accident, it's probably going to be just fine. So you can draw a really rich, rapid inference from very sparse data because you have these abstract laws here, right? You actually don't know what it's going to do. You've never seen it, but you can make a prediction, right? That's good. What if you're wrong? What if you go ahead and do that and it explodes? Now what are you going to do? Well, there are a bunch of things you could do. You could say, this is some brand new substance in the world. When you mix it with an acid, it turns blue. When you mix it with an oxidant, it explodes. It's something I've never heard of or seen before. You could do that. Or you could explain away the data. You could say, oh, maybe the mystery vial just got a little bit contaminated with the acid here, and that's what caused the explosion, right? So you have the option not to posit a brand new entity. You could just explain away the data with reference to your existing beliefs, right? So the question we wanted to ask is whether children, first of all, would use sparse data to make these abstract laws that would enable rich inferences. And then if they got evidence that violated their beliefs, would they go ahead and try to explain it away with reference to those initial principles that they had learned. So we did it like this, but the point here I want to make is that the constraints that let you learn rapidly from sparse data and make a quick inference about that vial also could make you intransigent in the face of counter evidence. Here's how it works with the children. We're going to show them a red block and a blue block. If you put them together, you get a train noise. If you put a blue block and a yellow block together, it makes a siren noise. The red and the yellow block do nothing. So it's exactly analogous to what you just saw. Okay? So the kids learn this about these kinds of blocks in the world. Then we show them. And if they are just learning about these particular blocks, all they know is about these particular blocks. If they're just concrete learners and they only learn from these, that's the whole world. But if they're drawing a generalization and they assume there's 3 kinds of blocks, then that's what their world looks like. Now we show them a mystery white block, we put it to the blue block, and it makes a train noise. If there are 3 kinds of blocks in the world, the kids should think, well, that's a lot like the red block, right? And if it's a lot like the red block there, then if you put it with the yellow block, it shouldn't do anything at all. So if you see the white block go behind the curtain and a yellow block there, and in fact it makes a noise, you might think, well, there's not 1 block behind the curtain, there's 2. Everyone got it? By contrast, if you see the red block hit the white block and make a train noise, you say, oh, well, it's a kind just like the blue block. And blue blocks do interact with yellow blocks. Blue blocks do make noise. So if you see the white block go behind the curtain, the yellow block make noise, you don't have to posit another variable. This evidence is perfectly consistent with your causal belief. It's a slightly complicated experiment, so I'll keep it up there for just a second here, but it's really exactly the same as the chemistry experiment you all just went through. And what we wanted to know was children are all seeing the same evidence, and they've never seen anything behind the curtain, but would they go ahead and posit the existence of some other entity back there just to explain away the data? Now, we actually ran, this is everything I just showed you. We actually ran a whole set of other conditions where we flipped it, we changed the causal laws, and did make opposite predictions. I'm not going to walk you through all of that, except to say it flips the conditions under which you should think there's a block. And what I want to show you, I didn't need to do that because I'm only going to show you the first 2 data. The other ones look like that. We let the kids reach. They always got a white block in the first trial, and we looked if they reached again. And the kids in the condition where the evidence had violated those initial laws did reach again. They did think there was something else hidden back there. The reason I've walked you through all of this is I want you to think about whether this is a good inference or a bad inference, right? So the kids went ahead and they said, oh, in this case, there's something else hidden back there. And if there are only 3 blocks in the world, that's a really, really insightful thing to do, right? If there really are only the 3 blocks that we have, they're right. There's some other unobserved variable that explains it away, and that's what they should think. In our experiment, they were right. There were only the 3 kinds of blocks. We had to use another blue block there to get the noise out of it. But if they're wrong, then they look really silly. You've just seen the white block hit the yellow block and make a noise. Why are you denying the evidence for your own eyes and positing something else out there? Why can't you just learn that the white block actually did hit the yellow block and make a noise? And the really important point is there's no fact of the matter here, right? It depends on what the world is really like. If there really are 4 things and you just haven't happened to have seen that additional kind of thing before, you're going to be less likely to believe in it. right? And that's going to make you look like not a very good learner. But if there are really only 3 things, then you're going to look extremely smart. And it's exactly the same principle that lets you look smart in one case and lets you look kind of dumb in the other case. It's not different heuristics trading off with each other. It's a single set of inductive biases that just happens to cut both ways. Is that clear? Yeah.
So, in this experiment, it was pretty easy for, well, there was a lot of, there are a lot of ways in which the intermediate cause could have entered.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a little bit maybe different than the vital experiment, or your description at least, where it's perhaps somewhat unlikely that you would get a contamination. Whereas here, there's like a very large space where there's...
So, for instance, had we gotten rid of the curtain and actually banged it into each other, presumably all of the kids would have flipped over, right? So
yeah, maybe if the curtain was like thinner or like shorter.
Every one of these inferences is predicated upon a whole bunch of information working together, right? So it is clearly the case that if the evidence is super strong and it's very hard to posit a way that another variable would have gone in there, you're much more likely to actually have to change your theory and say, actually, this overturns what I believe. There really is something else out there. If the evidence is a little weaker or your theories are super strong, then you should, so all of these are graded. All of these depend on inference. We could have easily gotten rid of these results by removing the curtain. Is that clear? Yeah.
Trying to wrap my head around like the contingency thing. Go back to the 2 slides before. The box one, like the proof. Yeah. So why would we assume that Intel would say there's a hidden object behind? So it's simply basically a collision between the red and blue box would cause the music. So it is like just a contribution of the blue box together with a collision with whatever block. It doesn't have to be.
No, they know that's not true, right? So they know that red and yellow don't do anything. They know that red and blue make a tree and that red and yellow do nothing. So they're selective to the kind of thing they are. It's not any kind of collision will work.
They don't collide in that same order? I mean, if blue was on the left side, you might expect that. And when it's on the right, it makes sense.
Right. So we did this in a directional way, right? So we didn't flip the order of the. And that matters. Okay. So, So what I want to suggest with all of this is that there are lots of reasons, as I say, to think that children are using a bunch of very fundamental epistemic principles that we think are startlingly accurate that let them get the world right in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean that they always do get the world right in all of those ways, of course. And when I was speaking to philosophers, we talked about this as bounded rationality, but nothing rests on the term rationality here. Although I think something does rest on boundedness, right? It is really true that your information, your world knowledge, and the mere fact that these inductive biases themselves are going to affect how well, how accurately you learn from the world, even if all of these principles are in play. And there's lots of good reasons to think that they are. This is where I'm going to end this talk. There is another half hour of it that, depending on what we do this afternoon, I may or may not get to, where having showed you that kids understand that information is valuable to selectively explore in ways that do tend to support information gain. Information is also costly, and children are sensitive to those costs, and that affects not only how they learn from others, but also how they learn about others. And if we have time this afternoon, I'll try to get to that as well. Thank you.
So the idea is that they would have some kind of models and hypotheses, and you track also the complexity of the models that they can learn and use with age. Because you have very simple models, but then you can always complicate them more, make it more hierarchical, like in the models you have in here. Sometimes when you see the children start making it more and more hierarchical, then making it more complicated.
I think it's a hard question to answer in exactly that form because, of course, what we have are computational models, again, for how, for any given set of problems, you might be able to solve it, right, and what kinds of representations might be at play. And we have lots of reasons to think that limitations on working memory or attention or other things might limit what you can ask a child at any given moment. The deeper question might be, do you actually change the computational architecture, basically, that's available to a child as those information processing. So I've referred to information processing abilities and world knowledge as if they're these things that feed in to a set of fundamental principles that are essentially constant for development, right? So you could just sort of naively say, well, look, there's these basic probabilistic programming principles that are in place very, very early, and then what changes is basically, how long those programs are, how complicated they are, how many iterations they have to run over, things like that, what you put into them, specific nature of the representations, but the basic architecture is in place very early. Another thing you could potentially say is that effectively you learn to program yourself, and as these abilities change, you actually rewrite the principles under which you construct really the underlying. I think we don't know the answer. Yeah.
So this is maybe a related question. Do you have a way to incorporate this information processing limitations into your modeling work?
Another way I think that people have talked about this is like, do we know the algorithms that children are using to implement these things? Do we know what particular processes are at play? And the answer is no, I think. We know some cases. There are some experiments where people have suggested, look, there's one algorithm that would generate this kind of data if it's doing this, and here's another one that would do something else, and tried to distinguish experimentally. So I know Liz Bonowitz and Tom Griffiths have done some work on that. But for most of the kinds of developmental experiments that have been run, the answer is no.
This is sort of what we're going to talk about in the algorithmic level models of
we're trying to get there.
Learning, I think once you have an algorithmic model that specifies, say, some search algorithm or some data structure, then it's not that hard to incorporate information processing limits, right? We can talk about that more later, but I think to us on the computational side, the more interesting challenge is how do you describe these kinds of learning at all, when they don't fit with the kinds of, say, simple traditional model, mathematical models for learning.
So what does learning is hard mean? So my question kind of has to do more with so I think Seymour Papert believed that children were capable of all these things, so he didn't really have the experiments to show it. But I think his conclusion was that we're bad at teaching as opposed to learning is hard.
Probably both of these have some elements of truth. But I think that there's a lot of reasons to think that learning is hard. I think, in some of the experiments, you will just see what in some sense looks like you're giving kids good evidence against a belief that they have, because they're not overturning the belief. And for many people, that one simple thing says, well, why not, right? How much evidence does it take under what circumstances? What are they doing with it? And there's lots of, very good reasons to think you shouldn't overturn. The problem is there really are a lot of cases where you shouldn't change your mind. Right, and telling the difference between those cases where you should engage in belief revision and those cases where you shouldn't is, I think, actually really genuinely hard.
Sort of a follow-up question to that. Under this general idea that sort of making analogies between children's learning and prosecuting science, is it fair to say that the two sides of your talk are kind of both can be framed this way, children learn in all these ways that scientists do, but the reason why learning is hard is sort of like the reason why science is hard, right? all of those same factors at different points maybe can limit the progress of science. Science can be painfully slow, and even when it's successful, it's painstakingly forward.
I think that the whole point of learning not being deductive, right, about it being probabilistic inference is that you can get the world wrong, and that those bets that you place are hard to overturn, right? If you're going to bet one way, that means you're not betting another way. I have actually a bunch more. If there's time too, I can show you some other examples where something that's a very, very sensible thing to do and consistent with the data can nonetheless get you stuck. And that is clearly true in science, and that's clear too. And I think something, again, I didn't talk about now, but later, is that learning is also costly, right? You have how many years of graduate school? What are you going to do with it? right? How much time? At what resources? How many grants are you going to write to do which kinds of experiments? That makes learning hard, right? There are resource limitations both internally and externally, and choosing where the greatest potential for information gain is, knowing that in advance. There is real uncertainty. You don't know what the world is like. You don't know what's going to pay off, right? So there isn't a fact of the matter about what is best, right? There's just an attempt. And sometimes that's going to pay off, and sometimes it isn't. And that is part of what makes learning hard, right? And I think irreducibly hard.